Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Kavla Noar and the Family Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. This the second annual Pezi Goldberg Memorial Lecture commemorating the second yahrzeit of our Chaver, Pezi Goldberg, Zichrono Livracha. Once again, the Family Institute has joined hands with Kavla Noar under the able leadership of Dr. Rani Lachtel. And we have brought to you, once again, one of the most outstanding psychologists and personalities in the Jewish world today, Dr. David Pelcowitz. Kavla Noar and the Family Institute are two very distinct organizations with two distinct missions. But nevertheless, our alliance and collaboration on many programs is a very natural and understandable phenomenon because we are all working in the same arena, Kavla Noar and the Family Institute. We're working with our own people. We're working with the religious community, the Dati Haredi community of Greater Jerusalem. We are working with those that are hurting, and we're reaching out and helping families and kids have a better life. That's the arena that Dr. Lachtel and I are committed to. So though it is two organizations, in a sense, it's one mission. There are other reasons that we are working together. Dr. Lachtel and I are landslide. We both come from the same area of New York and Long Island, and we know each other for many years. And I know I can speak for Dr. Lachtel as I speak for myself to tell you what a schus it is for us to have made Aliyah and have had the privilege of being able to work with our own people here in Eretz Yisrael. Our lecture tonight, which is one of the many lectures that we present to the community with the Family Institute, has a different twist than any of the other lectures that we've presented to you. The psychology of happiness, implications for parenting and family life. Usually, our presentations here are meant to give you practical insights and knowledge given by excellent presenters who will help you to steer the course in a very difficult world to raise children and have family life. Tonight, we're going to talk about happiness. Usually we talk about kids at risk. We talk about families who have difficulty, of marriage that are distressed. We talk about domestic abuse. And tonight we're going to talk about happiness. It's a little strange. For a Family Institute, for example, and for Kavla Noar, who work with people who are in distress, who work with all of these issues that we bring before you to talk about happiness. It's strange for another reason as well. We Jews don't tend to pursue happiness as Americans do. The pursuit of happiness is almost a goal in life. I recall as a kid complaining to my mother, she should live and be well, she's 93. I remember complaining, Ma, I'm not happy with my teacher. She says, you're not happy? Go to school. But Mom, you didn't hear me. I'm not happy. She says, happy schmappy, go to school. She's in an adult home now. 93 Kanahara. I say, Mom, are you happy? Happy schmappy, that's life. So we don't pursue happiness. We don't even say Happy New Year. We say Lashana Tova. We add Umesuka. But generally, I haven't heard too many people say, Shana Ma'usheret. It's a nice phrase. Why don't we say, Shana Ma'usheret, Happy New Year? Some of our thinkers, even, look down on happiness a bit. None of us here remember Moses Montefiore. He was an Erel Chayid, somebody who did a lot for Eretz Yisrael in the past century. And he said, and I quote, Haderech hatova biyoter lahasagat ha'osher hi shelo lechapes oto. The best way to gain happiness is not to look for it. So religious Jews don't pursue happiness. We pursue mitzvahs. We pursue a kesher with the Ribbono Shel Olam. And happiness hopefully follows. But if happiness doesn't follow, we still put on tefillin, and we still make Shabbos, and we still pursue mitzvahs. And yet, when I met with Dr. Pelcowitz several months ago in New York, and we were talking about what the topic tonight should be, we decided it should be happiness. And Dafka, to talk about it here in Yerushalayim. Because even though we don't pursue happiness, we find that without happiness, the rosters at the Family Institute are full, and at Kavla Noor as well. People come for help because they're unhappy. And kids go off the derech when they are unhappy. And marital partners who do not find happiness, it has ripple effects throughout the family and ultimately throughout the community. So happiness is something that we seek even if we don't pursue it. And this is why we felt that we need to talk about happiness. Derech Agav, Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, is simply saying that without a happiness, without a simcha, you can't be even an Eved Hashem in the right way. So there's a crux of happiness to religious life. For most of the years that I was a clinical psychologist, was many years, the focus in the field was on psychopathology, on mental illness, how to treat it, how to assess it, how to diagnose it. More recently, over the past, at least the past decade, the emphasis in psychology has been on positive psychology. There are such topics as resilience. How is it 10 kids in a family, 9 go off and become thieves, and 1 becomes a doctor, a lawyer, a successful person? How do some people have more resilience than others? What is resilience? And what is happiness? And what is a successful relationship? The emphasis is now on positive psychology. Well, ladies and gentlemen, one of the most positive people I know is a positive psychologist by the name of Dr. David Pelcowitz. And it gives me great pleasure to bring to you now the man who is going to introduce him, and that is Dr. Rani Wachtel.
Bruchim Habayim, and welcome to this, our second yahrzeit commemoration of the untimely death of Chezi Goldberg, Hashem Yikam Domo. Those of you who joined us last year heard me share the fact that I met Chezi for the first time only 2 weeks before he was tragically killed. Those of us on the staff at Kavla Noor, and many of you in this room who work with Anglo teens who engage in at-risk behaviors as they confront the world around them, will always be grateful to Chezi for the pioneering efforts he made in bringing their issues to the attention of the mental health community here in Israel. The spring 2004 issue of Viewpoint excerpted an article that Chezi had written entitled, "Teens, Despair Not, Don't give up. Permit me for a moment to quote briefly from this article. Dear teens, he wrote, kids at risk often get a bad rap. Just because some teenagers look strange, dress different, and act outrageously, people assume that he or she is the guilty party. Not always. Just as there are families with risky teens, there are teens with risky parents and risky families. I want you to know, he wrote, that you are not alone. I want you to know that there are those of us who understand your side of the story. We must face up to the reality that often you kids find yourselves in situations that are troublesome. Objectively speaking, it is not easy being a kid. After all, I remember not too long ago the trials and tribulations of my childhood and adolescence. Growing up is hard to do. May all of us be reminded by Chezi's powerful words and insights to look at our children and at our clients as, quote, a precious mold pressed and formed by Hashem in his wisdom, creativity, and love. I'd like to just take this moment to extend a very personal welcome to Shifra Goldberg, Chezi's wife, and her two daughters who have graciously joined us here this evening. We're truly delighted, as we were last year, that you could be with us. And we share in your loss, and we hope that this evening will perhaps represent a small source of comfort for all of you. Before introducing our guest lecturer, I would like to thank three very special couples, this evening's sponsors. Please join me in extending a Yasher Koach to Mel and Sylvia David, to Simcha and Esti Fass, and to Alan and Sophia Ziegler for the support they provided for this evening's program. May each of you be zocheh to good health, much nachat from your families, and the ability to continue your acts of chesed on behalf of Klal Yisrael. And may all of us be inspired by the example that you have set for us. There are a number of people who I wanted to acknowledge, but I don't see them here, so I'm going to just skip this next section, except to acknowledge one individual who I do see, my friend Joel Rabibo, who is the editor of the weekly edition of Hamodia, who has been a real true friend to all of us at Kabbalah Noah, but especially to me, and of course to his wife Miriam, my colleague. And also, Joel, for your technical assistance and for your words of encouragement. We are very appreciative to you. When I approached my friend and colleague, Dr. Yisrael Levitz, founding director of the Family Institute several months ago, to ask if we could once again partner in sponsoring tonight's program, his immediate response was a resounding yes, b'simcha. Thank you, Yisrael, for your friendship and wise counsel that you have provided to all of us at Kabbalah Noah as our fledgling organization begins to take root here in Eretz Yisrael. Yasher Koach to you and your staff for the important contribution that you are making to the mental health of our religious community here in Israel. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the tremendous assistance provided by two of your staff members, Penina Feigenbaum and Dinda Mendlowitz, who were most helpful to me in arranging for this evening's program. Finally, a very special warm thank you to Joyce Boyne, who recently informed us that donations received for the flower gemach that she and her husband Stanley founded in memory of their son David Reuven, Hashem Yikam Damo, who was killed in a drive-by terrorist shooting, will be directed to Kabbalah Noah. May the efforts of our work, enhanced by your chesed, be a source of nechama to both of you. Dr. Pelcowitz received his bachelor and master's degrees from Brooklyn College and his PhD in psychology from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Pelcowitz served for over 20 years as a clinical professor of psychology in psychiatry at both the Cornell University College of Medicine and the New York University School of Medicine. During the same period, he also served as director of the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at North Shore University, Long Island Jewish Hospital. Dr. Pelcowitz is a leading expert in family trauma, child abuse, and at-risk youth, especially as these issues affect the Jewish community. For more than 20 years, he has advised community agencies, schools, and families throughout the United States, and more recently throughout the world, in the wake of tragedies such as natural disasters, school violence, or large-scale sexual abuse cases. When Dr. Pelcowitz leaves Eretz Yisrael this coming Sunday, he will be traveling to Sri Lanka as a consultant together with a group of binational trauma specialists to assist the communities in Sri Lanka who were traumatized last year by the tsunami. Dr. Pelcowitz has also led continuing education workshops on issues faced by the Jewish community for professional staff at leading Jewish organizations. Just yesterday, Dr. Pelcowitz presented 2 3-hour workshops here in Yerushalayim for the staffs at the yeshivot and seminaries who educate the young men and women who come to Israel after high school graduation to learn for 1 or more years. He's also the author of numerous clinical studies and has published extensively in both professional and Jewish scholarly journals. He currently serves as professor of education and psychology at Yeshiva University's Azrieli Graduate School of Jewish Education and as a special assistant to the president on issues important to the Jewish community. Dr. Pelcowitz also teaches courses on counseling and family education in the university's Kollel Elyon. Last week, while standing online at our local post office in Rehavia, Rabbi Beryl Wine, the Mora de Asra of the shul where my wife and I daven, came in behind me. I began to share with him tonight's lecture and the topic, the psychology of happiness, that our speaker would address us on. Rav Wine, with his inimitable wry sense of humor, said to me, "Tell Dr. Pelcowitz that I hope he figures it out." Last year, Dr. Pelcowitz spoke to us about raising healthy children in an unhealthy world. Those of us who heard him, came away feeling that we had spent a most worthwhile evening being engaged by someone who wove a tapestry of divrei Torah and psychological insight. Once again this evening, we have the pleasure of hearing from someone whose endearment to so many of us here in Israel continues to grow because what he shares stems from the depths of his neshama. Please join me in welcoming our guest lecturer, Dr. David Pelcowitz.
Thank you so much. I hate hearing these things, but I was reminded of a famous comment made by President Johnson of the United States. Did you ever hear this? He was given a very complimentary introduction for one of his speeches, and he gets up and he says, "And I wish my parents were in the audience." He says, my father would have been proud and my mother would have believed it." So that's the spirit that I hear these things. So thank you. Okay. Let me move on to talk about the topic at hand. And of course, L'Zecher Nishmas Chezi Goldberg, whose life was about the kind of happiness, represented the kind of happiness that we'll be talking about. The kind of simcha that hopefully by the end of this talk, I don't know that I figured it out, but I think that at least I could share with you some of the current thinking from both a Jewish perspective and a psychological perspective. Let me start with a double enigma, a double puzzle. Okay, I'm going to start by telling over 2 vignettes that on the face of it don't make much sense. And then hopefully at the end, I'll try to pull it together so that the 2 vignettes will make sense. Enigma number 1 is a little paragraph in one of the best-selling books of all time, best-selling nonfiction books of all time. Many of you have heard of it, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, a very powerful book written by a psychiatrist about his experiences in the concentration camp. And he has a very puzzling paragraph in the book where he talks about a young woman, barely past her early 20s, who's in the typhus ward in the last minute of her life. She calls him over. She says, Dr. Frankel, there's something I have to tell you. She says, I could see through the slats of the wood on the ceiling here, I could see a tree, and I could see the sky. And at this moment, I appreciate life more than I ever have. I've always had a pretty frivolous life. I never knew what was important. She goes on to say, Dr. Frankel, this is the happiest moment of my life. And she closes her eyes and she dies. So that's enigma number 1. Happiest moment of your life as your life is slipping away when you're barely 21 years old, 22 years old. That's enigma number 1. Enigma number 2 is I'm at a High Lifeline retreat a few years ago, a retreat for parents and children who are struggling with facing life-threatening illness. And it's towards the end of Shabbos, and a group of parents are sitting down, about 50 couples, all of whom are struggling with their child, facing different serious illnesses. And one Hasidic guy raises his hand and he makes the following comment. He says, this Rosh Hashanah, my son was diagnosed with leukemia. This Yom Kippur, 10 days later, I was sitting in shul, and a wave of happiness washed over me like I never felt in my life. And I hear it, I don't understand it, but I look around and I see the other 49 couples are nodding their heads in agreement with tears in their eyes. So the talk I want to give tonight, which has direct implications for the work of Chezi, has direct implications for us as parents, has direct implications just sort of in terms of understanding this topic, which is a very important topic, is to answer those 2 puzzles. It's to try to contrast the modern Western view of happiness, the Happy New Year happiness, and to contrast it to the happiness that was described by that young woman in the last minute of her life, and the happiness described by that Hasidic father several years ago, describing his psychological experience of struggling with the tragedy of dealing with a child who was facing a life-threatening illness. Why is it important to understand happiness? It's important to understand happiness. That's what the psychology research shows. The psychology research shows that people who are happy tend to be less selfish, they're more giving, they're bigger balei tzedakah. They tend to be kinder, they're less likely to lose their tempers, they're more forgiving, more loving, more trusting, and I could go on, but basically happiness in life is connected to all kinds of important other issues that make us better Jews, better parents, better members of the community. Happiness is important. It matters. It matters. So, obviously, to the extent that happiness matters, it becomes important to think about this and talk about it. It's not a topic that's typically talked about. It's not a topic that we don't learn in school very much about what is underneath it, and yet we make decisions based on it. You ask the average American, okay? I hope this isn't true in this country, but I can tell you what's true in the United States. You ask the average American, what would it take to make you happy? Okay? The number 1 answer is more money. More money. Everybody says that. Everybody whispers that. Would that be the answer in this country? I don't know. It's an interesting question. Huh?
Try
Couldn't
it.
hurt. Couldn't hurt. A little more money couldn't hurt.
Let's do an experiment.
Okay. So, yeah, it does, it's right. And you know what? Money doesn't hurt. What is it? Dorothy Parker said, I've been rich, I've been poor, and rich is better. Right? So there's no doubt about it. I'm not arguing it. I'm not arguing it. But people make decisions based on that presupposition. It becomes front and center. So as a matter of fact, if you want to look at how things have changed, starting in the 1950s, every year in the United States, there's a survey of entering college freshmen. And they ask them, what are the top things on your mattering map? What is the most important thing to you now that you're entering young adulthood? What is it that you want to accomplish? What are your main goals now that you're embarking on your lives? In the 1950s, the top of the list was finding meaning. Top of the list was connecting in that way. Making money was there, but it was barely in the top 10. Since the 1960s, 1970s, certainly in the last decade, every year that they've done this survey, the answer right at the top of the list is making money. It's making money. And that's what makes people's decisions. People make all kinds of decisions in life based on the field that they want to go into, based on choices of pretty much everything that they decide to do in terms of career planning and in terms of choice of mate and choices of where they want to live, etc. It's based on that basic assumption that money is going to be happy. So what in fact does the research show? This research shows that what Shlomo Melech said, Oev Kesef, or Yispa Kesef, is 100% true. This is a true story. You're not going to believe this, but it's a true story. And I had it happen again recently, just a couple of months ago. December, the end of December in the United States is bonus time. Bonuses are back, by the way. There's been a new economic boom in the New York area, and bonuses are back. So I had a guy come to my office. He was literally clinically depressed. This was in the late 90s, about 7-8 years ago. And he's depressed. Why is he depressed? And he's like crying, and he's really, you could see, he's like schlepping into my office. I never met him. He can't concentrate at work. He can't go on. He doesn't know what he's going to do. There's no purpose in this. I said, what happened? He said, I got my bonus, my end-of-the-year bonus. I said, how much was your end-of-the-year bonus? $500,000. Okay, right? So I said, really, $500,000? I said, okay. I said, so I asked, obviously, all these years of training, right? What was my question? So why are you depressed? He was begging for me. He said, the guy in the office next to me got $750,000, and I'm every bit as good as he is. Okay? That's the principle. Psychologists call it the principle of relative deprivation. The more you make, the more you want to make. Okay? So it's never enough. It's never enough. No matter what, it's never enough. Now, obviously, people who are poor have a harder time being happy. But once your basic needs are met, the maskana of all the research on the money-happiness connection says it doesn't matter if you're the guy riding to work in your bus, on the bus with a lunch pail going to your blue-collar job, or you're the guy in the limousine next to him in the back seat going to your 7-figure job, your level of happiness is likely to be the same. As a matter of fact, in the last generation, the standard of living in America, corrected for inflation, has about more than tripled. And all that's changed is the American dream. So even though the standard of living has more than tripled corrected for inflation, there's actually as much more depression, actually, higher levels of suicidality, and all that's changed is the American dream. So the American dream now, typical American dream going back to the 50s was a house and a car. That was the American dream. Today, so you think, by the way, today, the latest census in the United States, it's really amazing. This is an eye-opener to me. There are more cars than licensed drivers in the United States, which I didn't understand. How could you have more cars than licensed? It turns out that people have specialty cars. You have a car to go out for a night on the town, and then you have a car, I don't know, so you have a car to throw out the hitchhikers? I mean, what do you mean? There's a car for taking the kids on carpool. So you have, you can't just have one car. The car has to fit the occasion. So what's happened is that the American dream today is a house a vacation house, and at least, if you're of modest means, at least 2 cars. Okay? So the dream changes. Principle of relative deprivation. Let me tell you 2 quick stories. Not quick, I have time. Let me tell you 2 stories, 2 slow stories about relative deprivation. One is the story of Robert Frank. Robert Frank is the guy, very famous, very well-off economist in the United States. And he tells the following story, that this is my favorite money happiness story, because it captures it. It captures the psychological process. He was an idealistic guy. He graduates college, and he joins the Peace Corps. The Peace Corps was a place where idealistic young Americans would go after college to give back to the world. And he's sent to Nepal, where he's going to be a teacher. And they meet him at the airport, and the Peace Corps people drive him out to some very, very remote area of Nepal. Okay? And they drop him off, and they tell him, this is where you're going to spend the next 2 years. And he can't believe it, because it's a 1-room hut, no running water, no electricity. They say, this is your next 2 years are here. So he thinks to himself, I can't do this. No water, no electricity, no radio, no television. I'm going to go out of my mind. 2 years here, and then drop him off. He's go, they'll come back for him in 2 years. And he doesn't know how he's going to survive. But he said within a week or so, he didn't even notice, because everybody around him had pretty much the same living conditions. But then he said something fascinating happened. He got his first paycheck. You know what his first paycheck was? $40. He discovered he was going to be making $40 a month during those 2 years. But then he also discovers that nobody else in town is making any more than $30 a month. So he's making $10 more a month than anybody in that area of Nepal. And he goes on to write that he never felt wealthier in his life than he did during the 2 years that he spent in Nepal living in a 1-room hut with no water and no electricity on $40 a month. What a incredible lesson. It's funny. I thought I understood this. I thought that I was immune to relative deprivation, and my family's invited to a bar mitzvah. So it's a bar mitzvah of a relative of ours in a suburb of New York. And we get to our relative's house, and we're told, oh, here's the house you're spending Shabbos, and they give us the address. So we drive, and we go turn into a place that's an address, but you don't see anything. And you go up the hill, and you're driving, and there at the top of the hill is this unbelievable mansion. Like a castle on top of the hill. And we think, wow, so we have a nice place to spend Shabbos, terrific. And we go, and I ring on the doorbell, and the kid in the house says, oh, you're our guest for Shabbos. Let me show you to the guest house. So he gets in his car, and we follow him, and we keep going, and we spend Shabbos in this magnificent, magnificent guest house. Unbelievable. And I found that as Shabbos was going on, I was getting depressed. I was saying to myself, I can't believe these people have a guest house. It's nicer than my house. No, I have a nice house. I was perfectly happy with my house. But I was by the end of Shabbos, and I kicked myself. I said, this is relative deprivation at work, So it's a tough dynamic to fight, the principle of relative deprivation. But you have to remind yourself. You have to remind yourself to focus on, as long as you focus on how you're different from others, that's not where happiness lies. Happiness truly, truly doesn't lie with money. Truly doesn't. It's again, the wisdom of Chazal telling us over and over again how money is a trap. It's really a false source of the decision-making of many adolescents and many young adults. It's interesting, when I talk to groups of adolescents about this topic, they come alive. They want to hear about this. Adolescents want to hear about it, because nobody talks to them about it. And yet, it's something that's important in terms of, I'm not saying it's easy to have a life where you're not making a lot of money, but it's important to know, okay, where does satisfaction in life lie? What do we know about where life is satisfaction lies? And what implications does that have for parenting and for the topic of tonight, the underlying topic of how we could understand it in terms of bringing up the next generation. And how does it answer the two enigmas? So let me go, and I want to talk about 4 components of what the research tells us is associated with happiness. It's not the F of funds, not the F of money. It's the 3 other F's. And then I want to add a 4th F tonight. But any guesses on what the 3 other F's are? What are the F's that are associated with happiness? What? Family, okay. See, nurses are all I do. I mean, you're Schleim, I get the right answers. Friends, okay, right. And?
Fear.
Food is, you know what? Girls. Okay. I can really relate to that one. But it's very interesting. When I see high school groups, the girls, the first F they call out is food. Boys have other answers, but which I'm not going to talk about. Okay, those of you who work with at-risk youth can guess a little bit, but it's very interesting. But and food makes it, maybe female, right? Exactly. That's another possibility. You see, if you do keyword work, you can really get into the head. So no, the other F is faith, emunah. Okay, that's not fair because we don't think of emunah as faith, but it's faith. It's a good alliteration. Okay. So, it's those 3. Let me take you by them, and then I want to talk about a fourth ingredient, which and then I'd love to get a discussion going. So let's talk about it step by step. Let me start with the F of friends. The F of friends is nothing surprising about it. We know that clearly there's a lot of research that shows that the more people put a focus, let's say you have somebody with a career, and they put more focus in terms of their mattering map on friendships than they do on their career, they're much more likely to be happy. I spoke last year about the Roseto finding, the community of Roseto. Some of you may remember a community where as long as they put a focus on community and as long as they put a focus on friendships, they had the lowest death rate of anybody in that part of the United States. And as soon as they started to be like everybody else, they had the highest death rate. Let me just share with you a couple of quick statistics on the power of friendships and the powers of community. Here, just a couple of random things. I'm not even going to go over all of this, but just as an example. The more integrated we are with our community and friends, the less likely we are, I don't even need this, the less likely we are to experience colds, premature death in the form of heart attacks or strokes, and depression. Okay? There are more than a dozen longitudinal studies around the world which have concluded that people who are socially disconnected are between 2 and 5 times more likely to die from all causes compared to matched individuals who have close ties with family and friends and community. And it goes on. I'll do the last one. The last one is a fascinating set of studies done every year by the Harvard School of Public Health, where they find that they give each state in the United States, each of the 50 states, a social capital score, having to do with how much do the people in each state care about their chaverim. You know, the word chaver and the word chav, obligation, have the same etymology. To be a friend isn't just to have fun together. Again, happiness isn't fun. Happiness is obligation. It's chav. It's chav. It's a chov. Or to quote the Rambam, beautiful Rambam in the Mishnah of Avos, and Aseh Lecha Chaver, where he delineates the different kinds of friendships. So you have Chaver L'Daiga. You have, the lowest level of friendship is when you have a friendship based on common interests, a country club friendship. You'll be my golf partner and maybe I'll throw a business deal your way. And then you have a chaver l'daiga, where you worry about the same thing, you worry about each other. But the highest level of friendship, the Rambam tells us, is the chaver l'daiga, where you share a vision, you share a worldview. My guess is that all of us in this room are friends in that way. We're all chaverim in that way. And that's a clear source of happiness. That source of chaver chav. Listen to this. In a state where there's that kind of connection, there's a lot of volunteering, a lot of doing good through the community. So a state that has a lot of gemachs, the equivalent of a gemach, okay? Those states are, you're much more likely to be happy and you're much more likely to be healthy. To the point that if you move from a low social capital state where people don't care about each other to a high social capital state, it's as predictive of your health as whether or not you give up smoking. So those of you who are having trouble giving up smoking, I'll give you a list of the states you could move to. And, you know, if you're having a hard time, you can move to Indiana or someplace like that. That's the family, that's the friend component. So the friend component, I think, is clearly shown beyond a shadow of a doubt in that field, that basically we know that as long as we can figure out a way to connect our children to passion and a sense of caring and a sense of obligation to others, it makes all the difference in the world. I had a very interesting experience a couple of months ago. It was the 70th anniversary, I believe, of Amit, an organization in the United States that does a lot of wonderful work here, and what used to be, Mizrahi Women or something? Is that what it used to be called?
Mizrahi Women.
Mizrahi Women. Wonderful organization. And they're having trouble where, with the new generation, they're having trouble with getting volunteers. It was an organization of volunteers that built schools here and built hospitals. Did wonderful, wonderful work, as you know. And they had their 70th anniversary, and they asked me to speak at their, or to moderate a very interesting session at their 70th anniversary, where the topic was, where has all the passion gone? And what the topic was, is that in the New York area, but also throughout the country, Amit is finding that the new generation of parents and of children, there's no passion anymore. And where there's no passion, by the way, I don't think there could be deep-seated happiness. Happiness comes from passion. Happiness comes from connection to the community, at least in part. And a woman got up and gave a very impassioned speech. This woman must have been in her 80s. And she got up and she said, you know something, let me tell you what Mizrahi was like back when I came from the camps. She said, I come to this country in the late 1940s, I get out of the DP camp, and we're here. And we come to New York, and life was exhilarating. Life was filled with a real sense of passion and happiness. We had meaning. First of all, just to be alive, to take a breath, to not be under the thumb of Hitler anymore, to be able to walk the streets and hold your head high. We were passionate about that. We were passionate about Israel. We had a reason to live. We had to make sure that Israel didn't fall prey to the anti-Semites who were carrying on the job of Hitler. And we were passionate about our new families. She turns to all the young women and she says, where's your passion? Where is it? And what are you teaching your children about their responsibility? It's gone. It's dead. And in fact, the research is showing climbing rates of depression in our world. And interestingly, the wealthier the community, the higher the rate of depression, especially with adolescents. There's a phenomenon called affluenza. Okay, affluenza is a phenomenon where the highest rate of depression is found in adolescents from wealthy environments. And it's, okay, so that's the first F. The second F, I won't belabor the point, is very much tied to that. It's the F of family and time. I spoke about that in tremendous detail last year. The tape is available if anybody wants it. Basically we know that to the extent that we're tied to family and we put family first, and that's number one on our mattering map in terms of where we throw our time, is in these three Fs. There's going to be a sense of fulfillment, a sense of happiness, and a sense of passion that's going to trickle down to our children. You know, Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, said, parents aren't mechanchim. He says, parents aren't educators. He says, parents are mashbi'im. He says, what does it mean to be a mashbi'a? What's the root of the word mashbi'a? Shipua, right? Shipua. It's the rim. It's what trickles down from parents to kids. It's what our kids are going to pick up. To the extent that what trickles down from you to your children is a sense of meaning and a sense of purpose and a sense of passion and a sense of connection, your children will be happy. And to the extent that they're happy with that connection, they're going to be more likely to be immune from some of the dangers of the outside world and some of the temptations of the outside world. Before I end this section of F, the F of family, I don't believe I talked about this last year about my uncle's funeral. Did I talk about that, my uncle's funeral? You heard the tape? No, I don't think so. It's a thought that came popping in my head. I wasn't going to talk about it. But I had an uncle, my father's brother, and a wonderful guy, brilliant guy. Our family was always very proud of him. He had an unbelievable career. He was Adlai Stevenson's speechwriter, guy who was almost president of the United States. He was director of UN policy planning for the State Department. Very brilliant writer and wrote books. Was a professor at Johns Hopkins. And he was very active in the highest reaches of the United States government behind the scenes in terms of all kinds of wonderful, wonderful stuff. He's a guy to be proud of. And he was proud of it. He was proud of it. He died in his mid-80s a couple of years ago. And I went into the Washington area for his funeral. The funeral was a massive funeral, easily, I don't know, 1,000 people, whatever, huge audience. And there were two speakers. My father was the maspid, and my cousin, his son, one of his sons was the maspid. Those are the only two speakers. And what hit me, it hit me like a sledgehammer. If you didn't know who he was, you'd have absolutely no idea what this man did for a living. He could have been a simple Jew who was a shoemaker, you know? Because what do they talk about? What did my father talk about? My father talked about what a wonderful brother he was, and what a wonderful son he was, and what a wonderful Bal Midos he was, and he spoke about him as a family man, as a community member, as a guy who set up a lunch and learn program all around the Washington, D.C. area, etc., etc. And his son, my cousin, spent the entire speech talking about what a great father he was, and how fathering and parenting was number one, front and center in his mattering mat. And I realized after the funeral, because I went to be Menachem Amal afterwards, nobody had any idea who this man was. And you know what? And then it hit me. You know what? They didn't know who he was. That's who he was. And that's what matters. And that's the way he's going to be remembered. And his books are probably gathering dust. And the secretaries of states and presidents who he might have known, and whatever impact he had on UN policy planning, is history. But what lives on is his spirit in his children and grandchildren, etc. And it was a lesson for me. Nothing really matters except that. And that's the source of happiness, and that's the source of what matters. And I bit my tongue during the Shiva visit as all my cousin's friends came to be Menachem Aval. And I didn't say anything, and my father didn't say anything. Nobody said anything, because you know what? They got who he was. So we just have to remember that. We have to remember that. At the end of the day, that's all that matters. The final F, before I go on to a new topic related to happiness, is the F of faith. Very important in terms of understanding at-risk kids also. And something that we probably have to do a better job of in terms of transmitting spirituality. Let me talk about that a little bit, about the F of faith. We know, for example, here's just a simple study. Every day a week that a person goes to Minyan, there's a higher level of happiness than a lesser amount. So if you go to Minyan once a week, you have a much higher level of happiness than somebody who never goes to Shul. Twice a week more than once, and so on. Why? I have my theories as to why, but it's probably the combination of the connection to Hashem, or the connection to the community, and that perfect storm of the three F's coming together through that action. And the F, the connection to gratitude, which is a whole other topic I'm going to, Mir Hashem, talk about later this week in a different setting. The research shows, it's very interesting. To me, this means a lot because I went to graduate school. I learned Torah B'das for a number of years, and then went from Torah B'das to get my doctorate at University of Pennsylvania, where it's not a very friendly place to religion. And there, what I was taught was that religion is a crutch. It's a sign of pathology. The view of religion back then was that, only people who are weak are religious, okay? And they took it was shaped by Freud, who himself had his own issues about religion, called religion a mass obsessive compulsive neurosis. It was all made up. They made it up. They made it up. So now what's happened in the last couple of decades is they started to research it. Hey, is this really right? Let's prove it. Let's prove that religious people really are more neurotic, more depressed. And they did the studies. And you can't lie. The statistics don't lie. Every single study shows the same thing. This isn't just one or two studies. Every single study shows that people who are religious are at a lower risk for depression. People who are religious, a true internal religion, are protected against some of the tougher times of life. They deal better with stress. And it's not the chant, it's the connection. It's the connection. Okay, in spite of your F, which I agree with. That's a whole other thing. Okay? It's so interesting to see because, I want to look up some of those old professors and throw a stack of articles on their desk. Just as one example, just to show you, because this will go to the next step. One example is that in 1955, a team of psychologists decided to study resilience. And they moved into an island off one of the Hawaiian islands, Kauai. And Kauai is a place that at the time had very high levels of poverty and abuse. It's a terrible place to live and to grow up. And they followed them into adulthood. And they found that a third succumbed to the ravages of the poverty and abuse, a third were in the middle, and a third were resilient. So what differentiated the resilient third from the other third? I spoke about this yesterday. Not surprisingly to us, one of the key predictors of whether or not you were going to be resilient in the face of having a very tough life was your level of religious observance. People who had a basic emunah were much more likely to do well with the stresses of life. Not surprising. Not surprising to me, not surprising to you. We know it. We know it. We know that if there's an emunah and there's the connection that comes, we know that if God forbid there's a tragedy that one of us faces, the whole kahila comes around and supports you and picks you up. We know that knowing how to respond to the stresses of life with davening and with emunah and with every bit of solace and comfort that religion brings us, if the religion is followed in a way that's truly internal and is genuine. Unfortunately, sometimes our children, through the mashpia factor, pick up different messages. And that's what becomes problematic sometimes. Okay, let me move on to the final set of points I want to make about happiness. And that's the point of I want to talk a little bit about joy, about fun, about the part of happiness that has to do with maybe the need for us to lighten up a little bit. Okay, to lighten up. Let me address that. Okay. First, I wanted to talk about some very interesting research that shows that happiness is in part tied to connecting to our children in a way that we milk their uniqueness so that their tafkid in life flows from pleasure and connecting to something they're really good at. I alluded to this last year, but I'm not sure if I spoke about this Rav Yerucham. It's such an important Rav Yerucham. Rav Yerucham Levovitz, who's my favorite psychologist, says the following. He says on last week's Parsha, on the Pasuk of Vishkafi Berchaso, that what was it that was the subtle message of each of the brothers getting their own unique bracha? He said that the bracha was the stimulus, it was the seed, it was the prod to develop the dominant trait in them that was unique and had to be developed. He says the most effective formula for character development is to fan the flames of the unique character traits that make us who we are. If a parent could give their child the bracha of fanning those flames and could reach them through giving them opportunities to fan those flames, that's when they'll be able to develop their potential and everything else will follow. But he says the path has to come through the unique bracha. Last year, I talked about a beautiful thought that I heard from Rabbi Brothman, the principal of Yeshiva Far Rockaway, at a conference for at-risk adolescents in the New York area. He said, notice how when you give your children a bracha every Friday night, notice how each of them relates to you somewhat differently. And notice it, this coming Friday night. As you give your kid a bracha, those of you who still have your kids at home, you'll notice that no two children react the same when you give them a bracha. They'll relate to you in a way that's the point of their uniqueness. And what Rabbi Brothman says, he feels that part of the refuah for the problem of alienated adolescence is to give our children a bracha every time we give them a bracha, but that's just metaphorical. To continue to give that bracha by helping them develop their uniqueness, because that's the source of growth, it's the source of happiness, because then they'll relate to it from a place of joy, not as a burden. And everything else, Rabbi Yerucham tells us, will flow. Okay? Listen to what Chazal tell us. You just think about this, about this component. He says, it's beautiful Gemara in Pesachim talking about the difference between Mizmar LeDavid and LeDavid Mizmar. It says that every time it says LeDavid Mizmar, the song started in David. It's his inner joy. Every time it says Mizmar LeDavid, it's the song that brought David to Simcha. And here's the beautiful lashon of the Gemara in talking about this. It says, Ein hashchina shore lo mitoch atzlos, v'lo mitoch atzvos, v'lo mitoch schok, right? Shechina doesn't lie with sadness or laziness or frivolity, the false form of happiness. The New Year's Eve party where you get drunk. V'lo mitoch kalas rosh, v'lo mitoch devarim b'telim, ela mitoch simcha shel mitzvah. Mitoch simcha shel mitzvah. Okay? What's the simcha shel mitzvah? Simcha shel mitzvah is the simcha that comes from connection and helping our children connect to what really matters. But what Rabbi Yerucham is explaining in his beautiful words on Ishkafi Berchaso is that connection comes best when we figure out what it is that brings our children joy when they connect to Hashem, when they connect to Tefillah, when they connect to what it is that pulls them in the most. It's probably the key to really being able to raise our children in a successful kind of way. Quick set of studies, just to show you sort of learning. And again, this may fall a little false on your ears because it's more American in its content, but it raises issues for me about this. Reb Michal Tversky once said in a talk that I heard him give, he's one of the Tversky brothers, and he very successful Rav in Milwaukee. He built a huge kiruv community in Milwaukee. He said whenever his agenda was to do kiruv, it failed. Whenever his agenda was to bring spirituality to somebody, he failed. He says when he was successful with kiruv was when he had no agenda. When he was successful in kiruv, it was when he just connected to people. He'd have them over for a meal and just related to them as people. That's when change takes place. As Chazal tell us in the Gemara in Ksubos, Amar Reb Yitzchak, Bu'usha hiskinu sheyehei adam misgalgel in bino at 12 shana. You just have to roll with your kid until they're 12 years old. Afterwards, it gets a little more complicated. Misgalgel in bino. Such a beautiful lashon. Misgalgel in bino. Okay? It's beautiful. By the way, if we were only misgalgel with our children until 12, when they're adolescents, they'd be ready to go. Because then their passion would have been unleashed. And the spark would have been lit. And they wouldn't have been turned off by many unpleasant experiences until age 12. So it's that part of happiness. Is happiness is connection. And in fact, somebody who I often talk to Dr. Levitz about, and he talks to me about, is one of the main psychological theorists on happiness, talks about flow. I won't tell you the name of the guy, because it's impossible to pronounce. Like Chisel Mensky or something. I've given up on trying to pronounce this poor guy's name. But his idea is that he finds that happiness comes when there's a state of flow. A state of flow is what comes when there's a perfect meshing of the demands placed on the individual and the level of interest they have in the tasks that they're doing, and they get so lost in their excitement and passion and connection to the tasks that they're doing that a state of happiness comes over them. All too often, we don't create an environment for our children where that state of flow can take place. But to the extent that we could do it, it would be wonderful. 2 quick vignettes about this. One is the Postville, Iowa vignette. Postville, Iowa story. Strange story. Postville, Iowa, you all know what's there? It's one of the strangest places on earth. You go to Iowa. I once had to go there for 4 or 5 days to consult on a situation they were having there. Postville is a strange place. Iowa is probably the most non-Jewish place in the world. It also has more cows than any place in the world. There are a lot more cows than people. So the Ravashkin family discovered that if you bring the schlachtais to where the cows are, you can save a lot of money. And it's become the largest kosher meat processing plants, I believe, in the world. A lot of meat here comes from Postville, Iowa. Meat from all over. They have the mashgiachim. It's an amazing thing to say. So you have the mashgiach sitting, watching. I spent a lot of time there. So you have the badats and the chassidish shteit and OU and everybody's sitting and davening over the same meat, and then whatever. It's an interesting process. So I'm from out of town. I can say whatever I want. What are you going to do to me? So I'm there, and it's a group. So again, you're walking among Iowans. You come to Postville, and it's all Hasidic people walking around. It's like you think you've been dropped. I can't describe what it's like. Okay, so I'm there doing whatever it was that I was doing there, consulting, and I become friendly with the principal of the local yeshiva there. And he explains to me that they don't have any secular studies after 3rd grade for the boys. No secular studies at all. They just have a Limmudei Kodesh after 3rd grade. And a day after I'm there, he gets a letter. The letter has in it the Iowa scores. Iowa is a famous achievement test in the United States. Happens to be the Iowa test. And it's the scores on how do these Hasidic kids, who don't have any education in the secular area after 3rd grade, how are they doing in math compared to the rest of the Iowans? How are they doing in reading, etc.? So I figure out, it's not even fair to give them, but by state law, you have to give the kids the test. And he shows it to me. He knew he was going to get a reaction. And I look at it and I nearly faint. Here are kids who haven't taken a math class since 3rd grade, haven't had a social studies class since 3rd grade. And you look at it, and 98th percentile in math, 94th percentile in reading comprehension. I mean, some of the kids did as low as 70th percentile, but everybody's above average pretty much in town. So I asked him, how could this be? This doesn't make any sense to me. So he smiles. You know, there isn't much entertainment in Postal. He was going to shut me along. He says, come tonight to a barbecue in the Ravashkin home. Now, by the way, a barbecue in the Ravashkin home, you're going to get fresh meat. Literally in the shadow of, a former cow. Very recently a cow. So, the F for food, right? The F for food. We have a new F. So I go to the Ravashkin home, and the principal's waiting for me. He takes me to the basement of the home. And there are the children of Postville sitting behind the computer. Now, they're not allowed to, there's no internet. There's no entertainment there. I spent the week with the kids, and the kids were telling me, what do you talk about? They talk about the cow that got away, or the cow that they had the greatest stories. That was their hobby. There's something else the kids in Postville did. They were allowed, the only thing they were allowed to do was they were allowed to play educational games. So there were games like Math Blaster, and games like, these advanced reading comprehension games. To them, that was fun. That was their entertainment. And without anybody intending it, it developed their math skills to the highest level. Now, obviously, learning helped even more, but their reading comprehension skills to the highest level. That's story number one. Again, it was joy for them. It wasn't you didn't have to give tests, okay? It was the lightness of that, okay? It was Misgalgel in the know, okay? Second story is a famous study. It's a study by some Israeli psychologists, a fascinating study. Some of you may have heard of it. They looked at geometry levels in a group of Haredi Mesivta boys, okay? Learning in Mesivta, the equivalent of 10th grade. And they compared their reasoning. This was published in one of the leading educational psychology journal in the United States. And they studied large number of Haredi kids on geometric reasoning, kids who never took a single course in geometry. They learned Gemara. They never took a single course in geometry. And they compared their geometry level to a group of Chiloni kids who had at least taken 2 courses in geometry. And I wouldn't be telling you the story if you didn't know the outcome. The outcome was, who do you think did better? The Haredi kids did better. And they even describe in this study that they approached the geometric puzzles and the geometric tasks with the level of joy that was totally the opposite of the sad, downtrodden, angry approach that the Chiloni kids showed. Okay? You see where I'm going with this. Where I'm going with this is obvious. Where I'm going with this is that there's something about connecting to children, connecting to adolescents, connecting to them in a way that just taps the underlying natural simcha and motivation and doesn't get in the way with conflicting messages, that taps into their uniqueness and taps into their internal drive. Very often, we introduce noise into the system that gets us into trouble. Let's go back to the enigma. What's the answer to the enigma? The answer to the enigma should be pretty obvious by now. What do they mean when they say they're happy? What they mean when they say they're happy is simcha as sham moach. Simcha as sham moach. It's where your head is at. As the Baal Shem Tov said, "B'makom shemachshavto shel adam shamhu ha'ish." It's all where your head is at. The Hasidic guy at the Chai Lifeline retreat, his head on Yom Kippur was connected to everything that matters. Sitting down in Shul on Yom Kippur, surrounded by his friends, surrounded by his family, and surrounded by his faith and his emunah, and his pure tefillos of davening for his son, he was happy. He was connected to what matters. He was connected to simcha. He was connected to what matters. That girl lying on her deathbed in the concentration camp was experiencing the purity and clarity of thought that comes from connection to all that really matters in life. To quote the Rav Dessler in the Mitzvah Eliyahu, he says, better understanding of what really matters will cause an individual great joy. Because as we know, ein simcha keheter haspekos. There is no greater joy than the resolution of doubt. There's no greater joy than clarity and connection to what really matters. Or as the Chazon Ish said, for one who knows the light of truth, there is no sadness in the world. So that's the answer to the enigma. I spoke on a related topic last year in California, small shul, and by some weird coincidence, there were 3 people in the audience, small audience, maybe 60, 70 people who had come to hear a talk by Minchul Amarav. And they all came over to me. Each one of them had lost a child in the last year. I didn't know what the odds were against that. And I heard that and I thought, oh, what have I done? Here, how arrogant of me to be talking about this. But each one said that they experienced that kind of happiness in the past year. It's not happiness as we understand it. It's happiness of a connection. Happiness of a connection to what matters. And that's the parenting take-home message, and the message, L'zecher Nishmas Chesky Goldberg, that we want to talk about here. It's the message that to the extent that we could figure out a way to teach our children what matters, to teach our children what matters in life is the passionate things that have to do with connection to our faith, connection to our friends, and connection to our family. That's the best antidote I could think of to some of the pitfalls that lie in their way. Let me end with a story. I spoke about music, and I spoke a little bit about flow and uniqueness, and how so many different ingredients could sometimes be the source of Yeshua for people. We just have to fan the flames of a person's uniqueness in order for them to find happiness and reach their tafkid in life. I'll tell a story that I told yesterday. Story of, and it hit me that it's a story that I could end today with. It's the story of a talk I gave in the New York area after 9/11. And after 9/11, I had a very, just before 9/11, the summer before, I was in Eretz Yisrael, and I was giving a talk to a group of trauma therapists here. And I was interrupted that news just came in of a bombing in of the Hebrew University cafeteria. 7 people were killed, and this trauma center was overwhelmed with requests for help, and they were short-staffed, and they asked me to go with an Israeli psychologist to an area where there was a summer program where a young woman who had been killed in the Hebrew University bombing was a madricha of this summer program. So we go, and they put me and the Israeli psychologist in a corner, and they tell the kids, we have 5 coping rooms to help you cope with this tragedy. One coping room is a letter writing room where you could write letters to her parents about what a wonderful woman she was. Another coping room you could express yourself musically. Another coping room you could express yourself artistically. Another coping room you could express yourself through davening, through tefillah. And another coping room you could talk to these shrinks here. The kids divided themselves equally among 4 of the rooms: the music room, the letter writing room, the talking room, and the art room. Nobody chose the tefillah room. It was too soon. But also, it's interesting, and this is related to the faith issue, is that it was too soon to daven. They were all in a psychological state of aminos. They just found out that this beloved woman had been killed, who they really loved during the summer. But also, it was too soon. It was too soon to daven. But also, kids find it hard sometimes to relate to tefillah early on. But if you handle their response to tragedy right, there's some new research coming out that's showing clearly that one of the best pathways to help adolescents understand religion is by talking to them about death and bereavement and tragedy in a way that's honest and open and helps them connect. Very often kids who were brought back from the brink, it's through the way we deal with them around tragedy. It's another topic, but it's an important point. So I learned a lot. I learned about how there's a lot of there are many ways to cope. And I go back, and the next week I was asked to give a talk about 9/11 to a group in New York. And I tell the story of the 5 coping rooms. And a woman raises her hand, and she says, I have to tell you a story. She said, my father, who's still alive, she said, is a vision chassid. And he was in the camps. They were teenagers with Elie Wiesel. They were in the camps together. And I went to a lecture that Mr. Wiesel gave last week. Mr. Wiesel, the Nobel laureate, the famous author who writes so beautifully about his terrible experiences as an adolescent in the camps. She said, I went to a lecture. I figured I'd go over to him. Maybe he would remember my father. She figures it's over 60 years ago. Probably doesn't remember him. But she figured it's worth a shot. So she goes, she waits in the line, and after she gets up to her father, to Mr. Wiesel, she asks him, by the way, I'm so-and-so. My father was so-and-so. I'm wondering if you remember him. You were in the camps together. And Mr. Wiesel says, remember him? And there are tears in his eyes. He says, remember him? He saved my life. And she says, well, he never told me he saved your life. And he goes on to say the following story. He said there was a horrible, horrible day in the camps. Worse than all the horrible days. It was the middle of the winter. We were being tortured horribly. We were malnourished. We couldn't take it anymore. We're teenagers. What do we know? And a group of Russian prisoners of war had gotten a hold of some rat poison. And they decided to end it all. They patiently waited in the line, taking the rat poison, and they laid down and died. One after another after another. Mr. Wiesel says, we looked at each other and we said, you know, something's not a bad idea. They have a great, who needs to go through this? We're not going to survive this anyway. Let's go. And he said, they all patiently formed the line of the adolescents in that barracks behind the line of Russian prisoners of war. And they waited, and he said, we had all lost our faith. Many of us weren't dati before the war. Those of us who were, some of us lost our faith. He said, your father never lost his faith. He didn't join the line. He stood outside of the line, and he broke out into an ancient, magnificent Vishnitsa nigun of Ani Mamin Be'emuna Shlema B'Vias HaMashiach. And he said it broke the suicidal spell. One by one, each of us left the line and joined him in a circle. And every one of us joined him in song, and it saved our lives. That's the message. It's the message of uniqueness. It's the message of happiness. Because there was simcha. Even in the shadow of death, there was simcha. Even in the camps, there was simcha through music. Even there. And we have to keep our ears open and our eyes open to the needs of our children to connect to what really matters. Because if we can help them connect to what really matters, may they all be zocha to experience the true happiness of what comes from family, friends, and faith. Thank you. So let's get some questions going. Or, I know it's late, I'm sorry. I'll start with you and then I'll move it on, okay? Yeah.
You talk about how without passion, it's much harder for a child to have happiness in life and the self-confidence in who they are. What if a parent doesn't know where their own passion lies? And what if you're talking about that generation that isn't have one?
Right, so I hate reality. Reality is so there I'm talking about these nice lofty ideas and then I'm brought right back to the ground. You're right. What happens, as I knew somebody had to ask, that's the first question, okay? What happens if the parents lack passion? You're right. You're 100% right. And that's why, in dealing with this, you're 100% right. In other words, like, when I talk about parents as mashpiyim, what I'm really asking you all to do in terms of either your own children or your friends' children is to recognize that the refuah lies in us. The refuah lies that we have to, and by the way, there's so many ways to connect to passion. I didn't talk about a whole area that I wanted to talk about because I forgot. And it didn't fit any nice little F. But the area of required helpfulness. The area of required helpfulness is the area of, that there's a lot of research that shows that, that if we could give our kids something to connect to in terms of connecting them to things that matter. You know, it's what happens with some of the kids here who go into the army. It's what happens with kids who get connected. I see kids who get pulled into chesed through camps for special children or children facing life-threatening illness. It transforms them. It's transformative. You get kids who are at risk to get involved in a Tomtei Shabbos soup kitchen kind of thing. And you see them light up. You see them turn around. So to the extent that parents, there's always room for passion as long as you go beyond yourself. So the refuah, I agree, lies in parents recognizing that the best thing they can do for their kids is to connect themselves, even though that may be something that they're too overwhelmed to do. But it's at least little by little to do that. That's where Yeshua lies. You know. Thank you. It's a very important point. Can I tell one more story and then I want to hear from you? Okay, I want to hear from everybody. But one quick story that I forgot to tell. Such a good story. It's a good story. Or is it too late? It's okay. The nace is late. Okay. It's a nice story, and it brings out this point, and it's one of the major streams I wanted to talk about that I forgot to. It's a required helpfulness story. Again, High Lifeline Retreat. It's a High Lifeline Retreat, and there's a man who, again, I said this yesterday. There's a man who had gone through horrible tragedies. Chassidish guy, Satmar Chassid. He had lost 2 children. And then he has 12 children, 12 surviving children, and one of them is diagnosed with leukemia. And we're spending Shabbos, and I was working that Shabbos with a group of men, all of whom had kids with different kinds of cancer. And Shabbos is going on, and they're getting more and more depressed. It's not the usual experience I have. Usually they start to feel, a sense of hadracha, a little less yish. It's amazing what a group can do with people with similar problems. What is it, Rov Tzaros Chatzi Nachama. But this wasn't happening with this group. And finally, as people felt comfortable enough, they will turn on this Chassidish guy and they say, "You're getting us so depressed. Here, you've been through the loss of 2 children. You have a child now with cancer. And you're so upbeat, and your children are so upbeat. You're getting us depressed. You're making us feel like we don't even have a right to be upset. What's wrong with you? You're so happy. You're so happy." So he's embarrassed, and he looks at them. He says, "Look, I really don't know the answer." He says, "Well, let me give you what I think might be a little bit of a hint." He says, "Every Sunday, my 11 children have a tafkid. Sunday afternoon, we pile them into our big van, and we drive from Monroe to Hackensack Hospital, where my son is being treated for cancer. And I have a rule, from the very first time that they had a visit, that they can't leave the hospital till they visit every single child on the pediatric hematology oncology unit. They have to visit everybody or they can't go home." So he said, at first, my kids were really upset. They said, "What, you think an Italian and Irish kid wants to talk to people who look like us?" They point to their payas. And he says, "I don't care." He says, "You're just going to do it. Just do it." And they complained, but they did it. And of course, as you can imagine, it became the highlight of their week, to the point that he told us that his children became incredibly close to a number of these Irish and Italian kids. And it was they couldn't wait to leave for the hospital because it was the highlight of their week. It energized them. So it's that idea that if we could figure out if we have the passion, we have to transmit it to our children. If we don't have the passion, it's lo b'shamayim. You know, the passion comes from connecting to what matters and going outside of yourself. It's true you're tired, it's true you're overwhelmed, it's true there are parnassa problems, but it's energizing to get outside of yourself. And that's the bottom line. Yes, you're going to ask something? Yeah, yes.
I wanted to ask you, what do you do in a society which cherishes modesty and not touching and not overwhelming with feelings of love and affection? How do you transmit a kind of message to your family that there is love and there is passion in a society which negates to a great extent that feeling?
So you're saying, I hear what you're asking. Okay. Okay. I hear the question. So the question is how do you it's a very legitimate question. Thank you. I mean, I hear you're asking. You see me going for time here. Okay. The question is the bottom line is this. The bottom line is this. There are many ways to express love and compassion and warmth through non-physical channels. So, for example, in terms of one of the tasks that couples have to come up with, young Orthodox couples have to come up with, is that there's a cycle in terms of certain times of the month that you could express yourself physically, and certain times that you have to express your intimacy and your love in a non-physical way, and which is actually not a bad lesson for life. In other words, that there are different components. Now, in terms of warmth and hugging, there's nothing that I'm aware of that would stop that from being expressed to kids. It obviously has to be expressed within the confines of halacha. Interestingly, a study done in the 1970s by a man named Prescott looked at over 30 cultures and found that the more a culture had physical affection shown to children when they were young, the less aggressive that culture was. So the number one best predictor of level of aggression in a child was how much physical affection they received from their parents. Now, I'm not aware of any reason why that can't be expressed when children are young. It's true there's certain halachic restrictions that happen later on, but by that time, I think there are more verbal ways. Is it okay if do you want to take this at all? This is very much... No, this is very much... This is very much... Okay, good, okay. So anyway, that's okay. I could have done it without trying to answer. I'm turning to Dr. Levis instead of Dr. Wachtels because he's a specialist in this area.
Hugging?
Okay, I'll behave. Okay, you have a question?
I thought you were going to sum us up with an extra F that we added.
With an extra...
The last F. You were going to give us a last
Family, friends, faith. It's fun. It's joy. It's joy. It's the joy of the kids in the basement of the Rav Ashkin house. It's joy in those kids with the geometry. It's the being megalgal and deno. It's the joy, it's the fun of, but it's not fun.
It's not more like fulfillment. I wrote down
Fulfillment. You have fun, okay? Graham has fun, so we're good. Okay. Fulfillment is good also. Fun, fulfillment. It's whatever. It's like a projective device. It's whatever else you want. Yeah, thank you. That's good. In the back, yes.
Hi, first of all, I want to thank for a wonderful lecture. I just want to make one correction. As a life member of AMIT of almost 20 years, the organization is now at the 80th anniversary.
Oh, yeah, you know what? I wanted to feel 10 years younger. Thank you. 80th, and it's a wonderful organization, and it's, what do they say, Ben Shmonin, what? Gvura. Ben Shmonin Gvura, may they grow in Gvura. Thank you. Those are the kind of questions I like. No, your question was great. Okay. Okay, let me take one last. Should we do one last? Should we keep going? Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
So you cited a study that said the more times the person goes to the actually
chance.
are. Is that study apply only to Judaism, or is there studies that show this similar thing?
I knew somebody was going to ask that. It's like the Kauai study. It's not just Judaism. No, it's connection. It's connection. You know, so it's got to listen, which is consistent. We know what Shechem and Sispanei Noach are. We know that there's that idea of the studies are done across religions, as is the Kauai study. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Not too many Jews.
Please.
You hinted that if we get across to our children faith and religion in a way that's internalized, then they do well and they get the benefit of faith. But you were sort of touching but not going there. We somehow, it seems to me what you were saying, that we blow it, that we are capable of giving across what we think is our value system and beliefs, but somehow not letting it penetrate to the kids. And I just wanted to...
Yeah. So the question is, and it's a good one for us to end on, the question is one of, are we falling short in conveying the eth of faith to our children? And the answer is, often we're doing a wonderful job. Just look at how the yeshivos are bursting. And look at how, there's like an unparalleled growth in learning and in spirituality. It's certainly in learning and hopefully in spirituality and in an internal kind of emunah. On the other hand, we know that in terms of talking about kids who are at risk, that there's also a sizable percentage of kids serviced by the two wonderful organizations who sponsored tonight, where they're eluding us, Interestingly, and with this I guess we can end, there's been some interesting research that I talked about before about what is it that turns kids on to the eth of faith. So when you do research in our community, this is specifically in our community, about what is it, if you interview a group of 100 adolescents in the Frum community, and you find out, okay, those who are turned on and those who are alienated, what is it that turns on the kids who get turned on? And it's a number of not at all surprising kind of findings. One is tragedy, I talked about. That if we deal with tragedy in the way that we're honest with them, when we talk to them about it, and we show them that in the face of tragedy, we're able to still go on. What tonight is about. What's tonight about? Tonight is about the little sparks lit in the all too short life of Chezi, Olav Shalom, okay? Continuing it in ways that really matter and that make him and what he stood for immortal, okay? Adolescents respond to that. They respond to all the beautiful insights that Yahadus has about tragedy. The other thing is Eretz Yisrael. It's Eretz Yisrael. Kids get passionate about this country and what it means, especially kids in Chutz La'aretz. They really do. They really do. And to the extent that we could connect them, it's unbelievable the levels of idealism. Adolescence is a time of incredible idealism. And it's just a matter of harnessing that. And if we could just show a little bit of it to them, it could be harnessed. Music. I talked about music tonight a little bit. And I talked about L'David Mizmar, Mizmar L'David, and music is a source of happiness and inspiration. It turns out that music and davening, using music and davening, and a lot of the beautiful wisdom that Hasidus brings us in terms of music, is a source of connection that is maybe all not tapped enough. Zmiras on a Shabbos afternoon, a Malava Malka, whatever. All those things are incredibly, incredibly important.
Some say stories of the tzaddikim, telling children.
So in stories. Why do I use stories so much? Stories are processed by the right hemisphere. And that's the last two components. It's what Chazal tell us in the Alpha Shimoni, is how do you motivate children? With Misha Libo Chafetz and Masha Libo Chafetz. And that's the way we'll end, okay? It's the Misha Libo Chafetz, the right shliach, or a story about an inspiring person. That's processed by the right hemisphere, which goes to our kishkas. And the Masha Libo Chafetz, finding the content that turns them on. You take that together, and that's the source of lighting up that end. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.